How hard and flexible were medieval swords, or for that matter, any other swords? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So funnily enough, this has come up in a couple of different discussions that I've been party to recently. One is a question about hardness. When I recently visited the windlass factory, we talked a little bit about hardness, and therefore that spurred some conversations that came from that. But equally, I've noticed a few people, including Ilya from That Works channel incidentally, who've talked about springiness of medieval sword blades. And particularly some people making the assertion that medieval sword blades were not the springs that we're used to in HEMA or modern replica world, and that they were in fact softer and more less springy and more likely to take a bend or a set. Just quickly before I go on, I am really starving. I'm going to have some tasty breakfast.
That is really nice. That is amazing that it's got no sugar in it, because it tastes great.
That is quite... I mean, I'm genuinely...
That is really nice.
I'm genuinely impressed.
Magic Spoon is the high protein, zero sugar cereal that you can enjoy at any time of the day. It's delicious and fueling and comes in 4 awesome flavours. Both the adult and the inner child in you is going to love these. As well as being really high protein and zero sugar, it's got no artificial ingredients. A Magic Spoon is awesome for a low carb lifestyle. But do you know what? All of that aside, it just tastes really, really good. I love all of the flavours actually, but my absolute favourite is cocoa. I'm a cocoa fiend. I love the bright colours and the branding, and I love the fact that you get little puzzles and games on the back of the boxes, just like you remember from when you were a kid. Not only does Magic Spoon come in 4 flavours, fruity, frosted, cocoa and peanut butter, it's also high protein, keto friendly, gluten free, grain free, soy free, wheat free, and it's naturally flavoured. And as a couple who like to try and keep our carbs somewhat on the low side, Lucy and I are absolutely delighted to have discovered Magic Spoon. If, like Lucy and me, you want to try out Magic Spoon today, then be sure to use my promo code SCHOLAG, or you can simply go to magicspoon.com/SCHOLAG. And do you know what? Magic Spoon are so confident in their product that they have 100% satisfaction guaranteed. If you're not happy with it, then they'll give you your money back. So check out that link below or scan the QR code that's on screen at the moment and use the code SCHOLAG. So thanks once again to Magic Spoon for sponsoring this video and giving us lots of cereal to eat. It's delicious. Check out the link or the QR code. So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the swords. So there's a few things to unpack here. Obviously there's hardness, are blades more likely to bend, take a set, break in historical periods, and indeed were medieval and Renaissance swords springy? Were they spring bladed? And how does that relate to the rest of the sword world? Well, let's just talk a little bit about context for a second, okay? So let's put down the Albion here, the replica medieval sword, and let's have a look at some other swords from around the world, because there's a lot of variety. There isn't only one type of sword blade made, there's not only one type of construction, only one type of hardness. So the first thing to say is that springy blades are to be found across the world. Okay, so here I've got my original English rapier from about 1620 to 1640, and I would not normally do this, but for the purposes only of this video, I'm going to demonstrate that the blade is indeed very springy. And I have other antique rapiers as well, and I've handled lots, and I can tell you they are springy. Now, many people I think are used to spring blades in HEMA because we use them all the time. We use them for training weapons like this Kvetten Federschwert here. Okay, so we're absolutely used to blades being springy. And some people have been like, oh, well, real medieval swords and Renaissance swords are not like that. But they are, okay? They are normally. But we'll come back to that point a bit towards the end. And the fact is, you know, I've handled lots of medieval swords and Renaissance swords, and they are springy. I can absolutely guarantee you. Now, I was recently watching Adam Savage on Adam Savage's Tested channel, and as you can see here, he was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, he got to handle some fantastic and rather famous, I have to say, medieval swords, including one of the Alexandria swords. And much to my surprise, you wouldn't normally do this with a museum sword, and certainly I would never do this with any of the Royal Armourers swords, for example, I'm working with the windlass Royal Armourers certified line. But people, I guess, curators, people, museum staff can make their own decisions, and you can, as you can see here, flex one of these blades, and they flex like a spring. Moreover, not do they only flex like a spring and return to true, But some of these blades actually flop under their own weight. So certain types of quite thin bladed swords, actually if you hold them out horizontally, they do flop like this. Well, if they were completely soft, they'd have a degree of flex to them, but if you flex them any further and they were really soft, then they would stay bent. Okay, right. So some other examples here. I have here a Burmese dart. This is an original antique with a nice maker's mark down there. This is somewhat springy. Now this is interesting. So I'll demonstrate here. I will flex it. Okay, and you can see it returns to true. It is quite flexy. However, this is where we get into metallurgy, and I'll keep this very brief, and also I'm not a scientist, I'm not a metallurgist. Fundamentally, although these are spring tempered, they are not quenched at a particularly high heat, and they are not incredibly springy. So obviously within a spring there's degrees of variation. So this one actually was somewhat bent when it came to me, and I very carefully straightened it. And so it is a springy blade. I can tell you from straightening it that it is springy, but its kind of yield point, the point at which it stays bent, is not particularly high. Okay, so yes, this is a heat treated, hardened and tempered spring steel blade, and it is somewhat springy, but if I bent it to about there, it would remain with a slight curve in the blade. Now mechanically there is an advantage to this in a world where you don't necessarily trust the steel, because bear in mind in the 19th century when people are making these things, and any century before that, you don't necessarily know exactly what steel you're working with. So you don't know exactly what the best temperature to quench it at, to avoid failures or to make it too brittle. You just don't know what you're dealing with. There might be inclusions in the blade, there might be slag, whatever. So whether it's a medieval sword or whether it's a 19th century Burmese or Indian sword, the fact is sometimes there's a safety margin built in. Okay, so having a blade that at a certain point bends rather than just snaps in a combat situation clearly might be a good thing. Okay, so I'll put that one down, and this is another, actually, that's a completely different type of sword, also from Asia. This is an Indian talwar. Now this is interesting because this is probably not an imported European blade, although lots of Indian talwars, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, had imported European blades. Now imported European blades were usually springy and spring tempered, and therefore if you do this with them, they spring just like this does. But this is probably a native made blade. This is an Indian blade. Okay, so despite the fact that this is an Indian sword, this is a springy blade, but not all Indian swords are like that, and I'll come back to that in a second. And for a final example, so we're covering most of the main continents, here is an African sword. This is an African cascara, and again many of these blades were imported, particularly made in Germany, sometimes other countries like Britain, into the Sudan. In this case this is a Sudanese sword, but you find other examples from other parts of Africa. And these are universally, as far as I've found, springy blades. This is a springy blade, exactly like those medieval swords in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that Adam Savage had to play with. So these are spring steel. Now most people go, oh yes, but they're European blades. However, there are also native made African blades, both on Tuareg Takuba, on these Cascara. This is almost certainly a native made blade, this one that's on this sword actually, and this is springy. The African blades are also springy. So absolutely we find spring tempered blades from medieval Europe onwards, all the way through obviously 19th century swords, sabres and cavalry swords that are spring tempered in Europe, spring tempered swords in Africa, spring tempered swords in Asia. But not all of them are spring tempered. So what am I talking about not spring tempered? Well, quite simply, there is another way of hardening an edge, and that's what we're fundamentally talking about here. So when we take a typical European sword of any period really that we know about, although I'll talk a little bit about earlier period European swords in a second, fundamentally we want to create a hard edge that can keep a good edge, okay, and stay sharp during contact with other swords, armor, shields, things like this. Okay, so keep a good cutting edge. And also in Europe, certainly beyond a certain date, we want a degree of springiness to give it resilience, both in terms of parrying, because that's a very useful thing when you collide with other people's weapons, okay, to be able to absorb that shock but still stay a straight blade, but also for thrusting. And really for thrusting blades, being spring tempered is really, really important, because if you're not spring tempered, then when you thrust a blade into something, it will flex and it will stay bent, okay, if it's able to flex, unless it's especially thick. So with a sword like this rapier here, or any rapier or small sword, or indeed a modern fencing sword, having flexibility is just essential, essentially. Okay? However, if you're dealing with cutting weapons particularly, or weapons that are somehow built in such a way that they're so thick that they're not going to flex, we'll come back to that in a second. If they are either unable to flex because of their thickness, or they're unlikely to flex because you're not thrusting with them and you're only cutting with them, you only need a hard edge. Okay? Now, if you only need a hard edge, there are some virtues to not through quenching and spring tempering something. Okay? Now, I'm going to get what's probably the most famous example of this construction method here. This is a new acquisition of mine, an absolutely gorgeous katana, which has come from Japan recently. And this is a Muromachi period blade, so this is possibly 16th century, potentially even earlier. And this is edge hardened. Okay, everybody knows, I guess, watching this channel, that Japanese swords are edge quenched. The way they do that is they cover the back of the blade in clay, so you get essentially a differential harden. That is, when they're water quenched, which produces a particularly hard edge with tamahagane steel, the back of the blade, or most of the blade, up to the back and including the back, is covered in clay, such that when you push it into the water, when it's red hot at quenching heat, when you push it into the water, the edge hardens very, very quickly and becomes very, very hard and crystalline, and the back hardens much, much more slowly. So you are hardening the rest of the blade, but to a much lesser degree. The end result fundamentally is a very, very hard cutting edge and a relatively soft back edge. Now, I've spoken in many videos about the advantages of this. The advantage is you can produce a harder edge than you'd be able to do realistically with most traditional European steels, for example, doing through hardening, because the blade would end up being too brittle. The edges of Japanese swords are hard but brittle. Think about something like stone or glass, okay? This is a very hard, very brittle crystalline structure. So while that cutting edge will be much harder than almost all European swords, and a very, very hard cutting edge, it is also brittle. If you smash this into another steel object, it will chip. It will chip quite easily, in fact, and a lot of antique Japanese swords have chips in the edge and have to be reshaped accordingly. So very hard edge, relatively soft back. Another advantage, obviously, apart from having a hard edge, is that because the back is soft, this blade is very unlikely to break, because if it bends, you can straighten it again. And in fact, if we look in Japanese cutting competitions, we actually find this happens. Okay, with traditionally made Japanese swords, the blades do sometimes bend, and you have someone standing there to straighten the blades. So in other words, they have a low yield point, they'll bend relatively easily, but you just straighten them again. Okay, they're fixable, they're not broken, they're not gone, so that's an advantage. But it's not only the Japanese that edge harden, and it's not the only way of doing it. So other weapons, if I take what's a good example here? Let's take an Indian sword. So here we have a talwar that has a Wootz blade. Okay, it's got nice silver Koftgari hilt, beautiful Shamshir style curved blade with a Wootz pattern clearly visible. Now, these blades are often edge quenched. That is, just like the Japanese sword, they have a hardened edge but a soft back, but they do it in a different way. They don't do it with clay, hence you don't end up with the hamon like you do with the Japanese sword. That's the wavy line, or sometimes straight line if it's a guha, on the cutting edge. Instead, it's usually done with pouring water. So the way that they currently do it in Nepal with kukris, and it's done with kukris as well as carried by the Gurkhas, is they literally use a teapot with water in it and they pour the water on the edge. So once it's at the right temperature, they literally go along the edge pouring the water and hardening the edge like that. Another way of doing it is having a trough and basically doing this in it. Okay, so you're just dipping the edge in. I'm sure there are other ways of doing it as well. However, I'm not aware of the clay encasing method that's used in Japan, and it's very, very famous because it's been featured on so many documentaries. I'm not aware of that being done in India. I think they find other ways of doing it. But fundamentally, the end result is somewhat similar. You end up with a hard edge and a soft back. And they're not the only ones that do it. In fact, I can tell you that some Ottoman swords are also like that. This may or may not be Wootz, I need to clean it up some more, but this is a Kilich or Pala. This is a 19th century Ottoman sword, possibly from the Balkans. But I can tell you that these have come to me, again, bent, and I have straightened them, and they are relatively soft at the back. But the edge seems fairly hard. So they do have hard edges and soft backs. I don't know how they achieved that, but they have done it. So these types of swords, and indeed Shamshir as well, are similar. I've mentioned Gurkha kukris or Nepalese kukris. They are usually edge quenched as well, soft back, hard edge, and indeed lots of other Asian weapons, for example, like this Moro Kris. Again, these have come to me bent, I've straightened them. I can tell you they've got fairly hard edges and they are fairly soft in the middle. I should also mention there's another way of achieving that. It's not only necessarily about how you quench. Also remember that sometimes in the material of a sword, we've got different materials. So sometimes you might have hard, what we these days call carbon steel at the edge, and in the centre you might have something more like iron or mild steel. Now iron and mild steel, when you quench them, don't harden, not like carbon steel does anyway. So if you make a blade that has a complex structure with a soft core and a hard edge, you can actually quench the entire thing, but only the edges will edge harden. So sometimes it's the difference of material. Sometimes it's that we've got hardened carbon steel edge at the edge and softer lower carbon steel or iron in the core. Now, at this point, having said what I've just said, it's an interesting point to now come back to European swords. So as I mentioned, Ilya at That Works made a lot of statements about medieval swords not being flexy like springs like we're used to in HEMA, and how that should modify how we train in HEMA and blah blah blah. Basically I don't agree, because there is a ton of, I was going to use an expletive there, there is a ton of evidence to show that springy blades, certainly by the 15th century, which is when all the HEMA sources really kick off, springy blades were absolutely normal. Okay, it is. So, I mean, you can see examples in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Adam Savage's channel there absolutely showed it. 14th, 15th century medieval swords are pretty much all springy as far as I've seen, and the hardness. Let's talk about the hardness for a second. So medieval swords that have been tested for hardness vary anywhere between about 25 Rockwell and about 45 Rockwell. Very occasionally as high as 50 in limited spots, but it's inconsistent. Now, regardless of the hardness, they all seem to be pretty much springy. Okay, you can literally pick them up and spring them. You can do this with them if the curator allows you to. Okay, I will tell you they are springy. So in terms of modifying how we train HEMA, I don't agree. Equally, in art, we can see people actually springing their swords. There's examples of people doing this with their swords. You wouldn't spring a sword if it was going to stay bent. And of course we know that they were making crossbows, which require steel, flexible bows on them, out of spring steel. So spring steel was absolutely normal by the 14th and 15th century. But is that true if we go earlier? Well, this is interesting. So a number of things change in the medieval period about how swords were used. So it is fair to say that when we go further back than the 14th century, swords were pretty much universally used either with a shield or a buckler, and the shield or the buckler would do a lot of the defending. So actually there was probably less blade on blade contact and binding, so there's less of a requirement for a springy blade. In fact, there's less of a requirement for a hard edge as well. So the requirement isn't there. It's a chicken and egg thing. Does one lead to the other? We don't know. But what is interesting is if we go back into earlier medieval periods, we start to find the steel, generally speaking, is of less reliable quality, except if we're talking about Ulfbert swords, but let's ignore Ulfbert swords because they're a bit of an outlier. And what we find is, obviously, when you get back into the pattern welded period, you've essentially got a pattern welded core of different types of iron and steel, some of which might not be hardenable. So if you've got particularly low carbon steel mixed in the pattern welding in the centre of the blade, when you quench your blade, even if you quench the entire thing, the centre might not really harden, at least not harden very much or hardly at all. Whereas the edges, made of carbon steel, higher carbon steel, will quench, will harden. So you essentially do end up with a blade that might have hard edges and a soft core. And this goes all the way back to the Roman era. So we know that, this type of complex construction of various types, both layered laminates but also pattern welding, started really in the Roman era. So Roman and early medieval swords, it is quite possible, had structures which were a little bit more similar to certain Asian swords, which have essentially a soft back and a hard edge for various reasons, either because of how they're quenched or because of the structure of the blade. So early medieval swords, yes, that might be true. Later medieval swords, pretty much we know that later medieval swords were springs. Okay, we've just got tons and tons and tons of evidence for it. And by the time you get to rapiers, which are really quite numerous, although they're not cheap, they're fairly numerous in the collecting world. We've got thousands, tens of thousands of rapiers surviving, and I can tell you they are all springy, all the ones I've ever held anyway. And all the medieval swords that you may be allowed to flex, all the ones I've seen anyway, have also been springy. So swords were springy. In terms of hardness, just to reiterate, so I was asked about this by one of my viewers earlier this week. In terms of hardness, there was some surprise expressed because in the modern sort of HEMA or recreation world, most people regard 50 Rockwell as a benchmark for replica swords, and that's fine. That's modern steel, it's reliable, you know what you're getting with it, you know the most optimum quenching temperature and this kind of stuff, because we've got the science now. They didn't have the science then. So I think they often erred more on the side of safety, and you'd rather have a blade which was slightly soft and more likely to bend than break. Okay. However, according to the tested medieval and Renaissance swords that we've seen, and obviously we're talking about 1,000 years of period there from 500 to 1500-ish, it does seem that most European swords varied between 25 and 45 Rockwell. And sometimes high status swords weren't necessarily the harder blades. There was a degree of randomness thrown in because of the nature of the materials that they were using and the inconsistency and inclusions like slag in the earlier blades. However, a good medieval blade you could expect to be 40-45 Rockwell at the edge, and that is notable also that if we look at Indian swords we get a similar degree. They are usually about the same as a European sword in terms of edge hardness, and that also goes for other spring tempered African and Asian swords. However, the real outliers and the unusual ones are Japanese katana, and when we get to Japanese swords, because of their very particular method of manufacture and material as well, bear in mind they're using essentially iron sand that's turned into tamahagane in a very, very particular process, and then water quenching the edge. Basically you do end up with much harder edges on Japanese swords than any other type of sword that I'm aware of, and that's undoubtedly one of the contributing factors to their legendary status. And so Japanese swords are frequently around 60 Rockwell on well-made examples, about 60 Rockwell on the edge. So Japanese swords are much harder on the edge compared to your, say, 40 in most of the rest of Asia and Europe and Africa, but bear in mind that that extreme hardness with traditional materials anyway, with old tamahagane steel or traditionally made steels in Europe or Asia, comes at a cost. When you go for extreme hardness, you often get extreme brittleness as well. So yes, it will be better at some things, and yes, it will be worse at other things. I hope that has been useful and interesting even. I realise it's a fairly complex topic and I might have skipped over and there are complexities which I can't explain all of in a video of this length, but nevertheless, hopefully it's been useful as an overview for some of you, and also great credit to That Works channel, Ilya and everybody else, the work they're doing there, and also Adam Savage and the work that he's doing there as well. Really, really useful stuff, brilliant. It like provokes these kind of conversations and deeper penetration of the information. And thanks once again to the sponsors for this video, who were Magic Spoon. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.